Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining. We're going to give it a few minutes as all of your fellow attendees join through the Zoom queue and join us in the webinar. Um, and as everyone does, I want to say a huge welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening for a conversation on Bad Bunny and the history of Puerto Rico with Dr. Jorell Meléndez-Badillo. I'm Amanda Jolly, content specialist with the World Affairs Council of Connecticut, and we have a phenomenal discussion planned for you tonight with an incredible speaker. We are thrilled to be hosting Dr. Jorell Meléndez-Badillo, a historian of Puerto Rico, the Caribbean, and Latin America. He is also the author of the critically acclaimed book, Puerto Rico, A National History, which is a fantastic read, and we encourage everyone to pick it up as soon as you can. He also collaborated with global superstar, who we all know, Bad Bunny, on his historic Puerto Rico residency and told the history of Puerto Rico through the YouTube visualizers that accompany Bad Bunny's recently, as of Sunday, now Grammy Award-winning album, DeBÍ TiRAR MáS FOToS. He's also an alum of UConn. So welcome back to Connecticut, and thank you so much for joining us this evening, Jorel.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here in community with you and everyone that's joining. Thank you for joining.
It's an honor and a pleasure. And before we dive into the conversation, I wanted to say a special thank you to all of our partners who joined us to make tonight happen from UConn Hartford and all of the councils participating from across the country. Tonight, we have people joining from Honolulu to Anchorage, from Atlanta to Portland, and from Hartford to Minneapolis. So thank you for being here. Welcome. And please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you're joining from. And feel free to add your favorite Bad Bunny song and follow along and comment as the discussion unfolds. I also have one piece of housekeeping, which is a great update. We have now have the opportunity to extend the conversation from 30 minutes, if that was the info that you've planned on. We now have the opportunity to talk for an hour tonight. So please stay with us. We are thrilled. We have a lot to cover, and an hour probably still isn't enough, but I can't wait to dive in. Lastly, I'll say if you have any questions, please submit them throughout the event. You no need to wait, and just feel free to put it right into the audience Q&A button, and feel free to chat throughout. So, Jorel, if I may, by my amateur count, and I think you probably have better numbers than me, there have been more than 775 million views on your YouTube visualizers that tell the history of Puerto Rico and accompany Bad Bunny's latest album. So, can you take us behind the scenes a little bit of this project, this collaboration, and tell us how did it come to be, and how did you decide which elements of Puerto Rican history that you wanted to highlight?
Absolutely. Thank you again for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. When I hear that number, I still can't believe it. Beyond my wildest dreams, I guess I'll start by talking a little bit about my upbringing. I come from a coastal town in Puerto Rico, Aguadilla, on the western coast, from a working class background. I grew up in the projects and a working class neighborhood with grandparents that only made it to fourth and sixth grade. So I was the first in my family to go to college, the first in my family to pursue a PhD at UConn in stores. And so I really became a scholar because I wanted to amplify access to Puerto Rican history. I wanted to take those knowledges that are produced in the classroom and take them out. And so in my wildest dreams, I thought that this was going to be the case, that I was going to be using Bad Bunny's platform to amplify Puerto Rican history. I thought that by publishing the book in 2024, that was sort of my mandate. And I guess that's where it starts. So I published the book with Princeton University Press in April of 2024, and it got a lot of traction in the United States, and it was translated to Spanish. And so it was also well read and well discussed in Puerto Rico. And, the Bad Bunny team was aware of it. There's a report from El Nuevo Día, a newspaper in Puerto Rico, that they say that they've seen Bad Bunny with the book. And so in December of 2024, I was traveling with my family on vacation. I was in Portugal in Europe. I'm a bit of a workaholic, so I had promised my family, my wife, my kid, my therapist that I was leaving my computer behind. And then all of a sudden, I received a message via Instagram through social media. Back then, I had it private, but three people added me, and it was weird. I saw that we had friends in common from the world of art, film, in Puerto Rico, so I added them. And one of them was a producer with Bad Bunny. And he said he asked if I was interested in having a potential collaboration about a potential potential conversation to have a collaboration with Benito. My heart dropped. I thought it was a prank, and then I saw an NDA, so it was real, it was legit. And so basically, it was a few weeks before the record came out, and so when I got on the call, they explained that the record was going to come out on January 5th, and that Benito was really interested in incorporating history into the universe that he was creating in this album. As we know now, Grammy-winning album right now, the album really pays homage to Puerto Rican history and Puerto Rican culture. It is a sonic archive of Puerto Ricanness with salsa, aguinaldo, plena, bomba, and it mixes all the sounds. And so he also wanted to include history. So I said yes, and the mandate was basically to write 17 different historical narratives from the history of Puerto Rico, from pre-Columbian times, that is, from indigenous times to the present day. And so those became the visualizers. And in the process, one of the things that Benito was very adamant was that he wanted these histories to be read not only by students at the University of Puerto Rico that have access to history, but he wanted these histories to be read by peoples in the projects and working class neighborhoods. And so that really resonated with me because one, I wanted to become a scholar to democratize access to history. And two, I come from the projects and the working class neighborhoods that he wanted to reach. And so for me, it was an incredible collaboration. And I guess the last thing I'll say in regards to that is that, I've been a fan for the longest time. I have a shrine, an altar in my house with things from Benito. I've seen Benito like 10 times in Puerto Rico, in Canada,
Wow.
across the United States. I wrote an academic article with my wife and colleague, Aurora Santiago Ortiz, thinking about nostalgia and historical memory in Bad Bunny's first record. So I've been following his trajectory. So when they contacted me, I really could not believe it. And, it was really an opportunity to amplify Puerto Rican history to the world.
Mm, phenomenal. And a lot of, I'm really excited to dive into that history tonight. And so tonight, throughout the course of the conversation, we'll be able to talk about the history of Puerto Rico and then also the modern context, how that's reflected in Bad Bunny's work. And so to bring us to the history and to your book, throughout your book, Puerto Rico and National History, you highlight throughout all of the years of history, you highlight the agency of the Puerto Rican people throughout and describe the nation of Puerto Rico as distinct, even as it passes through different political statuses and different colonial powers. So, to set the scene for us tonight, before we dive in, can you tell us a little bit about your approach to writing your book and why centering the agency of the Puerto Rican people was so important to you?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. When I presented the book, the translator, Aurora Lausardo, a professor of translation at the University of Puerto Rico, was commenting it and said that it read like a history of Puerto Rican indocility, how we are unruly subjects. And so I really love that because I think her comment captured the essence of the book. And so really when I was starting to think about how to approach writing more than 500 years of a history in less than 200 pages, I really needed to think about what I wanted to highlight. And what I really wanted to highlight was the ways that, you know, although Puerto Rico has been a colony for the longest time, legal scholar Jose Trias Monge famously called Puerto Rico the world's oldest colony. I really wanted to highlight the ways that Puerto Rican peoples have not tacitly accepted this. And so also, I was trying to challenge certain tropes and narratives about Puerto Ricans and Puerto Ricanness. There's a famous essay that was published in 1960 by one of our greatest intellectuals of the 20th century, René Marquez, called The Docile Puerto Rican. And he argued that we are docile by nature. And so I really wanted to challenge those narratives and those tropes. And I wanted to highlight the agency, the beauty of our cultures, of our peoples. And so, really, originally the book was going to be called Puerto Rico 500 Years of Colonialism, 500 Years of Resistance. But then I think that Puerto Rico national history captured that. Also, it's a provocation because legally we are, and we're going to talk about this later on, an unincorporated territory of the United States, a commonwealth. And so by calling it a nation, although we lack a sovereign nation state, it was a provocation. And I remember when the book first came out, there was a lot of debate in Puerto Rico about the name of the book itself. And so I really wanted to sort of challenge preconceived notions of Puerto Ricans. And so something as simple, I was talking to my students yesterday, I'm teaching a class on Caribbean history of how I was taught that an assassination of a conquistador in 1508, 1509, Diego Salcedo, I was taught in school, in grade school, that indigenous peoples did that to test if conquistadores were gods. And so by that simple event and how it's taught, it's basically reproducing the logic of indigenous docility. And so those were precisely the myths that I wanted to unsettle. And so I wanted to write, I once heard the great late historian of the United States, Howard Zinn, who wrote A People's History of the United States, said that he wrote that book because that was the book that he wanted to read. And so I guess that I wanted to read a general history of Puerto Rico that highlighted our agency. And so since I couldn't find it, I decided to write the book.
Thank you. Incredible. And there's a lot to read in the book, but we're going to go through some key moments. And if we can start at the beginning, as we get into history, can you take us back? What do we know about the pre-Columbian societies in the archipelago?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question, because one of the things that I really also wanted to do with the book was to decentralize or decenter the traditional starting points of Puerto Rican history that oftentimes begin in 1493 when Christopher Columbus arrives to Boriquén, the indigenous name of Puerto Rico. And I really wanted to think about the Columbian history, because we've been in the archipelago for more than 5,000 years. And so the thing is also that in this book, I wanted to challenge the authority that oftentimes scholars portray. And I wanted to be vulnerable on the page and really tell the reader there's so much that we don't know. We don't really even know how Taino peoples call themselves. Taino meant in the Arawak language, good person. And it was the way that indigenous people referred to the Spanish conquistadores. So we don't really know a lot about pre-Columbian past. And so the ways that we approach it is through a careful dance between archaeology, anthropology, history, and particularly the sources that conquistadores left behind. And of course, those sources are mediated by their own sort of subjectivity. We need to keep in mind that back then, in the beginnings of the conquest of Puerto Rico, which actually begins in 1508, there was a huge debate in the church in the Iberian Peninsula whether these people that they encountered in the Americas had souls or not. That is, if they were humans or not. And so, to answer your question directly, so we've been in the Caribbean region for about 5,000 years. There's scholarly conversations about how we actually populated the Caribbean islands. There's some people that argued that it was through the northern part, modern day Florida, and island hopping south. But now there's consensus that's starting to emerge that it's actually from the Orinoco River in South America, modern day Venezuela, that indigenous societies migrated through. through the Caribbean. I'm not going to bore people with the details, but there's a lot of archaeological sort of conversations about different ethnicities and groups like Ostionoides, Saladoides, Arcaicos. So there's so many names, but the people that I begin with are the Taíno peoples, the indigenous people that inhabited Boriquén at the time that the conquistadores arrived. And one of the things that I do in the book and I do in my classroom is that I really highlight the ways that these were advanced societies, highly structured. They had developed knowledges that, still accompany us to this day. And so also to challenge the hostility myth. And so in the book, people can read it and I invite folks to engage with it. But one of the things that I like to do is unsettle certain myths. You know, in the Puerto Rican anthem, in el himno, in a national anthem, it says that when Columbus put his feet in our beaches, he's exclaimed, "Oh, oh!" Columbus never set foot in Boriquén. He stayed in his ship. Another thing that I try to unsettle is that what if we think about the conquest not as a discovery of the Europeans, but the Europeans were discovered by indigenous communities when they were lost at sea, right? And so, what would it mean for us to think of the narrative from that way? Because ultimately, I really truly believe what Haitian scholar John Casimir argues that when we write the history of the conquest, or any history for that matter, we need to make a conscious decision. Are we narrating that history from aboard the ship with the conquistadores, or are we narrating that history from the shore alongside indigenous communities, enslaved communities, maroon communities? And so I decided to write it from the shore.
Beautiful. And as you mentioned, Puerto Rico has been called the world's oldest colony. Can you tell us who coined that term, where that name came from? And having gone through more than 5 centuries of colonization, can you walk through that colonial history, with the arrival of the Spanish?
Absolutely. So the Spanish, so to answer the question, it's a term by a legal scholar. He was a chief justice in Puerto Rico, I believe, Jose Trias Monge. And it's really for me, it's a provocation as well. But to answer your other question about the colonial history of Puerto Rico, the Spanish arrived in Boriquén in 1493, but it's not until 1508 that the island is officially conquered and colonized by the Spanish. From 1508 to 1898, Puerto Rico is a Spanish possession, a Spanish colonial possession, and there's so many things that happen in that period. There is, the emergence of Puerto Rico itself, right? Because back then it was Boriquén, and eventually they start creating this idea of Puerto Rico, which I talk in the book. The first time that we find the term Puerto Rican, Puerto Riqueño, in the archival record is by a military official in the early 1700s, referring to those people born in the archipelago as bastards. So it's in a pejorative sense that the term Puerto Riqueño exists. And so from 1508 to 1898, we are a colonial possession of Spain. And that ceases to be the case on July 25th, 1898, when the United States invades Puerto Rico in the broader context of the so-called Spanish-American War. And I say so-called because I always tell my students that that name erases the participations of Puerto Ricans, of Cubans, of Filipinos, of folks from Guam, of the Mariana Islands in this broader global conflict. But on July 25th, 1898, the United States invades Puerto Rico. In December of that year, they signed the Treaty of Paris, in which the war ends and Puerto Rico becomes a colonial possession of the United States. There's a military government for 2 years, from 1898 to 1900. And then from 1900 to 1917, Puerto Ricans basically carry a Puerto Rican citizenship that really doesn't have any weight in international courts. So we are in a legal limbo until the Jones Act of 1917 that grants Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans U.S. citizenship. We can go into the details later on, but it's a second-class citizenship. And so José Trias Monge was also articulating this idea of the oldest colony in the world because although in 1952, Puerto Ricans craft their own constitution, and on July 25th, 1952, we become a Commonwealth of the United States, really, when we look at a series of Supreme Court cases at the turn of the 20th century, which are still the law of the land, Puerto Rico is a colonial possession of the United States in the 21st century because we legally belong to, and this is verbatim from those cases, Puerto Rico belongs to, but is not part of the United States. We are foreign in a domestic sense, uh, meaning that we are a colony. And so that's why it's from. So, in a nutshell, from 1508 until the present day, Puerto Rico has been a colony. And so although that is the case, in the book, I wanted to highlight how Puerto Ricans have crafted an identity that is separate from the Spanish or the United States. And I think that later we're going to talk about Bad Bunny, but what we're going to see on Sunday is a manifestation of that identity that has been forged throughout centuries.
Excellent. Thank you. And as you mentioned, you explained how the U.S. came to take possession of Puerto Rico. And today there is still a lot of uncertainty in the United States, especially about the relationship between the U.S. and Puerto Rico. So, can you dive in just a little further to the current status? What is the current status between the U.S. and Puerto Rico? And can you tell us a little more about those Supreme Court insular cases that decided this status kind of along the way between 1901 and 1921?
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So as I mentioned, Puerto Rico becomes part of the United States or a colonial possession of the United States in 1898. And in 1917, we are granted U.S. citizenship. Uh, from 1901 to early 1920s, there's a series of cases that make it all the way to the Supreme Court. One was on the import of oranges from New York to Puerto Rico. Someone saying, well, now we don't have to pay taxes because Puerto Rico is part of the United States. And so that case made it all the way to the Supreme Court. Another one was on a woman that was trying to find her partner. And so she traveled to New York and she was stopped, sent to Ellis Island. And so that court case made it all the way to the Supreme Court. And the other one was by a labor leader, uh, Balzac, Jesus Maria Balzac, who basically there's a case of libel. He was trash talking the governor, and then he was like, no, but I'm protected by the First Amendment. And so that made it all the way to the Supreme Court. So in those cases, we have the legal precedent to Puerto Rico's relationship to the United States. As I said, they decided that one, Puerto Rico belongs to, but is not part of the United States. Second, that we are foreign in a domestic sense. And the third case basically decided that the U.S. Constitution does not follow the U.S. flag. And so, what does that mean? And that was decided after we were already citizens. So, it was decided in 1921. And so that means that right now I am in Madison, Wisconsin, or in Verona, a suburb of Madison. And so I'm fully protected by the U.S. Bill of Rights. But as soon as I get on a plane and land in San Juan, I am not fully protected by the U.S. Bill of Rights, and I lose the right to vote for the U.S. president because we can't vote in Puerto Rico. And so thus scholars argue that we carry a second class citizenship. And so we get our citizenship in 1917, and in 1952 we become a Commonwealth of the United States through a law called Law 600 that allowed Puerto Ricans to hold a constitutional convention, craft their own constitution. And so that is the legal status that we have until the present day. However, I think that, what complicates the Commonwealth status are those Supreme Court cases that were ratified in 2018 and 2019 in other Supreme Court decisions in relation to Puerto Rico. And also that we are currently, and we can go deeper into the current moment, we have a fiscal oversight board that was implemented through law PROMESA that has more power than the executive branch and the legislative branch in Puerto Rico. And so that sort of brings us back to that early 20th century colonialism. So it's a complicated relationship. If Puerto Rico was in social media, Puerto Rico would have in relationship status, it's complicated because complicated, but ultimately, I think that, the reality is that we can call it however we want, but really we are a colony of the United States in the 21st century. And I think that is why Puerto Rican history is so unknown in the United States, because it forces people to grapple with a complicated and messy history of imperialism and colonialism in the United States.
Mm. Thank you. And to follow up on how you just outlined PROMESA, um, the a turning point in the U.S. in relationship with Puerto Rico came with the debt crisis and the resulting PROMESA, which, as you mentioned, is the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act. Could you talk to us a little bit more about the debt crisis, what happened, and the impact of PROMESA?
Absolutely. So Puerto Rico, ever since the creation of modern Puerto Rico, which we can trace it back to the mid 20th century, there was this national project called Operation Bootstrap. And so this operation sought to industrialize Puerto Rico, but what it really did was that it made us dependent on foreign investments. And so ever since the creation of the Commonwealth, we've depended on foreign corporations arriving in Puerto Rico. There has never been a national economic plan rooted in our Caribbean reality. And so that was also amplified in 1976 when Puerto Rico was included in what was known as the Section 936 of the Internal Revenue Code, which basically made Puerto Rico a tax haven for U.S. corporations that relocated in Puerto Rico. They would not pay taxes for about 10 years. And what would happen was that 10 years came and they would change their name to get that exemption again. And so it was really, it was working for these corporations, but Puerto Rico barely got the benefit of it. And so that was phased out in 1996. It ended on May 1st, 2006. And so in my book, I argue that that is the starting point of the crisis that we have until the present day. We had a government shutdown on May 1st, 2006, that basically signaled that we were starting to enter an economic recession. When 936 ended, the Puerto Rican government did not have an economic plan in place in order to address it. And so before that, we also need to add as a, second sort of line, parallel line, the increasing debt. So as Puerto Rico, from modern Puerto Rico, we see if we sort of create a line, we see that it kept ballooning up the debt in Puerto Rico. And so the debt that we have is mostly from municipal bonds that get sold to people. And so I don't want to get too in the weeds with this, but I think this is important, and a lot of people don't know this. The same law that made Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans U.S. citizens made municipal bonds triple tax exempt. And so that is a catch for investors. And our Constitution of 1952, the Puerto Rican Constitution, argues that Puerto Rico it's constitutionally obligated to repay its public debt before paying for public services. Thus, we need to repay the debt. And so, as Puerto Rico's debt kept ballooning, in 2015, the Puerto Rican governor, Alejandro Garcia Padilla, went on television and said what everyone knew: the debt was unpayable. And so, because those bonds were triple tax exempt, and because we're forced to repay it, vulture funds, when Wall Street downgraded our credit to junk, a lot of vulture funds arrived in Puerto Rico buying Puerto Rico's debt for pennies on the dollar, knowing that Puerto Rico would be forced to repay that debt at the full price that it was taken. And so it was a recipe for disaster. It was a storm, a colonial storm, a fiscal colonial storm that was later topped by an actual storm in 2017 with Hurricane Maria. And so in between, we have the PROMESA law, which is a bipartisan law in the United States. I like to remind people that it was a Republican inspired law that was signed by the Democrats. And so at the moment, people thought that it was the right thing to do for Puerto Rico. Lin-Manuel Miranda appeared in the John Oliver show rapping about how he was going to give tickets to Hamilton to those senators and congresspeople that voted on PROMESA. But ultimately, what PROMESA did was curtail the autonomy, the little autonomy that Puerto Rico had, because the Fiscal Oversight Board is there to repay the debt and refinance the debt. And so they've done some refinancing, but what the Puerto Rican people wanted was an audit, because a lot of people argue that that debt was unconstitutional, that it's illegal, but we don't know who took that money. Uh, and so, yeah, so it's a very convoluted and very complex topic. And so one thing that I failed to mention and I forgot to add is that there was a an addendum to the 1917 Jones Law, which was the 1920s cabotage law, that basically it was a protectionist law that forces Puerto Rico to import only from the United States through the U.S. Merchant Marine in a U.S. vessel with an all U.S. crew flying a U.S. flag, meaning that we cannot trade with anyone else in the world, and we pay one of the highest taxes in on imports. And we need to keep in mind that because Puerto Rico has depended so heavily on foreign investment, we import about 80 to 90% of all the things we consume. So I think that the current crisis that we have in PROMESA, to understand that we need to look at that broader sort of colonial history that unravels throughout the 20th century.
Thank you. And one thing that stuck out to me in your book as well was it seemed like there was a rock and a hard place construction because, as you mentioned, Puerto Rico was unable to file for bankruptcy due to their status. And also at the same time, unlike a sovereign nation, unable to access the World Bank or IMF restructuring opportunities,
Absolutely.
which left few options.
Absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right.
well, I'm just repeating back your book. So, but can we follow what you mentioned before about in 2017, the impact of Hurricane Maria? And you mentioned in your book how, a personal story about trying to reach your grandmother during that time. And can you tell us what the lasting impact of Hurricane Maria was, the response of the U.S. government, and where recovery stands today?
Absolutely. I think that, now that I think of it, I was actually in Connecticut. I was at UConn.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Uh,
Mm.
yeah. So what I describe in the book, I felt in Connecticut,
Mm.
because I was abroad. I was not in Puerto Rico when it happened. But to your question, I think that, we have all these crises, compounded crises that are happening in Puerto Rico ever since the early 20th century, 21st century, perdón. And then in 2017, we have this massive, massive hurricane that bulldozes through Puerto Rico. And so Hurricane Maria was a Category 5 hurricane that bulldozed through the Caribbean, and it became a Category 4 hurricane when it made landfall in Puerto Rico on the night of September 19th, 2017. For a lot of people, Maria has never left Puerto Rico. We're still seeing the impact of Hurricane Maria. And so one of the things that I tell my students, and I used to teach a class at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, called The Politics of Natural Disasters. Disasters are not natural. They're natural events that cause human-made disasters. And so what happened with Hurricane Maria, and the reason why more than 4,000 people lost their lives, was because Puerto Rico was suffering from a frail infrastructure that is tied to all the economic and colonial policies that we've been talking about throughout the 20th century. And so Hurricane Maria barreled through Puerto Rico. And so for some people, they lacked electricity for about a year. They lacked potable water for a year. Uh, the Puerto Rican government argued at first that we had only lost about 12 lives, 16 lives, and then they keep growing the number until I think that the actual number from the Puerto Rican government was like 60 something people that passed away from Hurricane Maria. And then it was the private sector, a study from Harvard University and La Universidad Carlos Albizu in San Juan, that actually detailed that that number was closer to 4,645 people. And in their study, a peer-reviewed study, they argue that that was a low estimate. And so Hurricane Maria really became a before and after for Puerto Rican people. And so the way that I talk about it in the book is from my personal experience of my grandmother by herself in a wooden house in Puerto Rico, and my incapacity to communicate because phone lines were down, the internet was down. And so for a lot of people, Puerto Rico was without a state for a few weeks. And so people had to rely on their communities in order to survive. And so I think it became a turning point because people now were seeing the incapacity of both the local and the federal government. And then we had hurricanes in Florida and Texas, and we saw a different response from the federal government to people in the mainland vis-a-vis Puerto Rico. And so, I really think that Hurricane Maria changed the tone of the conversation about Puerto Rico's relationship to the United States, because it was the first time that I heard people in my family, and I come from a family of pro-annexation folks that believe that Puerto Rico should be a state of the union. I am not on board with my family on that, but we can talk about that later on. But it's the first time that I heard them talking about colonialism, using those terms, and imperialism. And so I think that for a lot of people, it was an awakening, it was a turning point, and I think it's because it was very difficult for people to survive. And, I think it exacerbated the crisis that we were living in Puerto Rico. And so one of the things that I really believe and I argue is that for that generation that came after me, I was born in the 80s, but those that were born in the 90s and to early 2000s, the only thing they've known in their life is crisis, one crisis after the other. The economic crisis, the debt, the Hurricane Maria, an earthquake swarm, the closing of schools, austerity measures, corruption, massive migration, displacement, gentrification. And so it's really a generation that the only thing they know is crisis. And I have a colleague at the University of Puerto Rico that calls it the crisis generation. And so yeah, that was all amplified by this massive natural event called Hurricane Maria.
Thank you for sharing your personal story as well. And if we can dive into that a little bit, a lot of Bad Bunny's music is talking about the independence movement, critique on potential statehood. And could you tell us a little bit about maybe even within your family, the difference between the independence and the statehood movements and where the momentum is today, or where they both stand today?
Absolutely. That is, for the longest time, it was a very difficult question to answer because, I think that part of the reason why the independence movement isn't bigger in Puerto Rico is because of political repression and suppression. We have a history of repression in the gag law, which was this law that basically prohibited any sort of uh, overt national symbols. It was really made for no one could talk about the overthrow of the US government, but really it was loosely interpreted legally. And so ever since the creation of modern Puerto Rico, we've had a bipartisan system electorally that alternates between the Commonwealth Party and the pro-annexation party. In the 1950s, the pro-independence party was the second place, the runner up. And that quickly changed with this sort of repression that I mentioned, which was exacerbated in the 60s and 70s with the creation of COINTELPRO and FBI agencies that infiltrated the movement in Puerto Rico. And so I grew up in a household in which my grandfather was afraid of me carrying a Puerto Rican flag because he had lived through those days, right? And so I think that that's why the potential to imagine Puerto Rican independence was curtailed by that repression from the Puerto Rican and federal government. And so I grew up hearing this phrase that I'm sure a lot of Puerto Ricans that grew up in the archipelago heard, that is that if we became independent, we were going to become another Haiti, Dominican Republic, or Cuba. And so beyond the xenophobic tropes of that phrase, I think there was a real fear of losing, political rights, democratic rights, access to potable water, access to healthcare, etc. And so we are lacking all those things, and independence never arrived, right? And so that generation that we call the crisis generation is seeing things a little bit different. So I think that the debate is now uh, it has a generational overtone. And so there's a younger generation that is not afraid of independence anymore, and that are there's a sector that doesn't even care about the political status of Puerto Rico. They're doing their own thing. They're imagining new Puerto Rico beyond political status. But I think that in terms of electoral politics, what we saw in 2024, everyone was looking at the United States and what was happening in the elections here. But we had a very important election in Puerto Rico in which Bad Bunny participated as a private citizen, paying for ads in the streets and joining the closing of a campaign for an alliance between the pro-independence party and the Citizens Victory Party. That party, the Alianza, got to second place. That is historic because we see that the bipartisan system is not working, has been eroded. And I think that, there's a shift, and it's generational, of people that are now not afraid of imagining an independent Puerto Rico, more so in the current context that we're living in the United States. And, when we talk about the Super Bowl, part of the conversation is who gets to claim Americanness, right? And it's definitely not a Puerto Rican, uh, regardless of his citizenship status.
Mm. And brought us beautifully to my next question was, which is Bad Bunny's been such a leader on these issues in this generation, not only in Puerto Rico but globally as a generational leader. And you write in your book that he has come to define a new generation. So what does Bad Bunny represent to this new generation, and what are people seeing in him? What does he stand for?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, he has come to define a generation, and I think it's the generation that he comes from, right? I think that artists are not detached from the historical moment that they lived through, right? And so Benito is the product of that crisis generation. He went to the University of Puerto Rico at a moment when it was being defunded through austerity measures. He is the son of a teacher. His mother was a teacher in a Puerto Rico in which, in the last decade, they've closed more than 400 schools due to austerity measures. In fact, the architect of that plan of closing schools ended up in prison for corruption charges, Julia Kelleher. And so Benito's part of that generation. And I think that, to give you a concrete example, in 2018, Benito dropped this song called Estamos Bien. We are all right. And so that became an anthem after Hurricane Maria. And I really, really, really dislike the term resilience because it obscures the reasons that force us to be resilient in the first place. And we're tired of being resilient. We want to enjoy life and not be resilient. But I think that that song captured the essence of what Puerto Ricans were living through. And I think that throughout his career, Benito's work has become an archive of the moment in which it gets produced. A lot of people say this is Benito's most political record. That might be true, but Benito has been political. El Apagón from Un Verano Sin Ti is a music video that turns into a full-fledged documentary on gentrification for about 20 minutes by journalist Bianca Gralao, directed by Cacho Lopez. And so Benito was using his platform to talk about power outages and also about gentrification in Puerto Rico and how Puerto Ricans are being displaced to make way to millionaires. And he's not making this up. It is codified in law through Acts 20, 22, and 60 that seek to attract millionaires to relocate in Puerto Rico and not pay taxes. And so Benito has been using his platform. And I think that not only that, a lot of people like my abuela, that now loves Bad Bunny with this new record. Before she was like, he's such a sucio mal hablao. He's always, talking about sex and all these things in his songs. But I think that there's also a politics of joy, of bodily autonomy, in a moment when there's so much crisis. And so people turn to reggaeton to enjoy their bodies, to enjoy themselves. And that was also political, and Benito was there doing that. And so I think that's why he has come to define a generation at a moment in which I think the biggest crisis that we have in Puerto Rico is the massive migration that we currently have. Benito is talking about how the people that leave were expelled. They didn't want to leave. And I identify with that in my bones as a diasporic Puerto Rican that dreams of returning to Puerto Rico and serve my country. And it seems like an impossibility at the moment because of all the things that we've talked about.
Mm. And through the deeply personal nature of your work and scholarship, can you tell us a little bit about your work with Bad Bunny on his historic residency in Puerto Rico and that experience, what the impact on Puerto Rico was? And also, was there a particular moment in this experience that you're willing to share that felt the most impactful to you personally?
Absolutely. I think that, collaborating with Benito, amplifying Puerto Rican history for his record, it was mind blowing. When that record came out on January 5th and I saw the visualizers, I cried. Uh, I've gotten pictures of people at the club dancing, and in the background there's Puerto Rican history. I was in a chinchorro, a dive bar in Mayagüez in Puerto Rico, and all of a sudden, uh, there's uh Puerto Rican history there as well. And so that had been very enriching. But I got to be so I was in Puerto Rico last academic year on a fellowship conducting research when all of this happened. So I got to see the build up towards the residency. It was incredible. Every single local news channel, every single local channel was talking about Benito, talking about the residency. And so really history became cool with a younger generation. Sales for my book exploded. I swear I was not looking for that when I wrote the book, but it happened because history became something cool in Puerto Rican culture, and that was all Benito. And so it felt like a different moment. It brought somewhere along the lines from 400 to $7 million in revenues to Puerto Rico, the impact of the residency. And so I got a call that Benito wanted to include Puerto Rican history before the concert started. And so as you're going to your seats and there's music playing, he wanted to project historical facts. And so I got to write 40 historical and cultural facts about Puerto Rican history that were screened in the residency, in the shows before the concert started. And so when I saw them live, I could not believe that. And also, I used the opportunity to highlight so many people, anarcho-feminist Luisa Capetillo, uh, who was arrested for wearing men's clothing in early 20th century. I highlighted the first punk band in Puerto Rico. I come from the punk community. That's why I have so many tattoos. In fact, this is Luisa Capetillo here. The
Oh, incredible.
got to highlight her story for the people in the concert. I also talked about our gold medalists in the Olympics. And so it was an opportunity to share Puerto Rican history again with a broader audience. And so, yeah, it was simply just incredible to be able to put my scholarship in the service of a pop artist that was using his platform to amplify it to the world.
Can't imagine that feeling. That's, yeah, the impact is huge. It's global in scale. And I want to encourage everyone. We have some great questions, and I want to make sure we get to all of our audience questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to add them now. And we do have a very interesting question I wanted to ask from Mary, who says that Bad Bunny is taking his tour to Spain. And how would you characterize the relationship between Puerto Rico and Spain at the moment? And how might the anti-colonialist message be received there?
Yeah, I think that The relationship is cordial in terms of government officials. Our governor was recently in Spain, and I saw pictures with the King of Spain. But I think that in terms of political discourse, Benito talks about pro-independence. It's anti-colonial in nature. So I think that, the people that will be going to the concerts know where Benito's coming from. Uh, and interestingly, he's going to Spain, former colonial metropole, but he's also skipping the United States, which is the biggest market for pop consumption. And he's doing so. He confirmed in an interview with Susie Exposito for IQ magazine to protect his fans from ICE and Homeland Security.
Mm.
And so uh, I think that, in Spain, they love Bad Bunny. They love reggaeton. They love reggaeton. I think a bit too much. Because they know all our artists, they know they made it, not when they go to Latin America, but when they go to Spain, because they have such a following there. So in a sense, I think that, we're colonizing the colonizer through our
Mm.
sonic projects.
Incredible. And I was wondering, we have a question in from Jimena, and it's what are some common misconceptions about Puerto Rico that you hope conversations like this one, and I imagine also the history that is being added to this pop culture spread, help to challenge?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. I'm actually about to publish an opinion piece in the LA Times about this particular question, actually. Uh, but one of the things that I believe is that, oftentimes when we think of Puerto Rico, when people know about Puerto Rico, it's through the trope of that tropical paradise, the piña colada, beaches, which is all true. Puerto Rico is beautiful. Uh, However, I think that what obscures is the dire realities of Puerto Ricans themselves that are, to live in Puerto Rico is an act of survival. And I lived through that last year when I moved back for a year for research. Everyday life is very difficult, and I think that part of what Benito's doing, he is using his platform to offer a history lesson to the world about what Puerto Rico is. And in his cultural universe, Puerto Rico is beautiful, but it's also very painful. And so I guess that some of the misconceptions is that, Puerto Rico is basically a tropical paradise, but the reality is that Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans are suffering the brunt of all these economic policies, colonial in nature, that make everyday life very difficult, if not unbearable, for a lot of people, with power outages on an almost daily basis, with lack of potable water at times. And so it's a very difficult experience. So I guess that what Benito is doing with this Super Bowl performance, what he did with this Grammy winning, perdón, record, album is showcasing how, on the one hand, Puerto Rico is beautiful and there's this beautiful cultural and sonic tradition, but at the same time, we cannot lose sight of the difficulties of Puerto Rico and Puerto Rican life.
Mm. And as you mentioned the Super Bowl, I want to bring in a combination of two audience questions we have. One from John, and also we have, oh, I don't know where it went, but Pablo, a teacher who will be teaching this as well. John asks, with the Super Bowl halftime show as a platform, any thoughts on which social, political, cultural messages Bad Bunny might focus on? And how much do you think will go over the typical viewer's head? Obviously, not this audience, but other audiences.
Well, to the first part of the question, I think that I've been talking to a lot of journalists this past week, and a lot of them have the question of will Benito use the platform to articulate an overt political message? And my answer is I don't know. If I knew, I couldn't say it because of NDA reasons, legal reasons, but I don't. Regardless of what Benito does or doesn't do, and I was very surprised that he actually use his platform in the Grammys to talk about ICE and immigration. And I commend him for that. And I'm glad that he did. Uh, even if he doesn't say a single word in the Super Bowl performance, his presence there is going to be political. And it's going to be political precisely the second question because I think it's an invitation to learn about Puerto Rico and Puerto Rican history. And it's also a combination of the previous question because I think it will force people to grapple with what is Puerto Rico. Because I think that a lot of the what's happening with this conversation around the Super Bowl, around language, and about why don't we have an American, they're rooted beyond, xenophobic tropes. They're rooted in ignorance, and I don't say ignorance in a pejorative way, in unknowing the history of Puerto Rico.
Mm.
And I think that the lesson's going to be there. My visualizers have been viewed 775 million times. Thank you for that number, Amanda, because I had left it in 600 something. So I'm glad that it kept going up. And it's not that 775 million people read Puerto Rican history, but there were 775 million opportunities to learn Puerto Rican history. And so I think it's not Benito's obligation as a Latino man to be teaching anyone anything, but he's offering the possibility of learning. And I
Mm.
think that is equally radical. And that matters so much in this moment of anti-immigrant rhetoric. Because Benito, when he said he's American, and this is something that I don't know, I haven't asked them, I don't know the answer to this, but when he said that we are American, I think that he is looking at the term American in a broader way, not US
Mhm.
centered, but more of a hemispheric way. And that is
Mm.
also deeply political. So I guess that I don't know what's going to happen, but regardless of what happens, it's going to be political because it's an opportunity to challenge preconceived notions of Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricanness.
Mm. Thank you. And I know we are closing in on our time together. So if I may do a quick lightning round, um, I have a couple songs here from Bad Bunny, and hopefully people who are interested might learn a little more, or people who haven't had a chance to check out these songs, please do. And I was wondering if you could just tell us the quick log line of the context behind this song. So the first one is the 2019 song, apologies for my pronunciation, Afilando los Cuchillos.
Yeah, so that is a song that was created during the summer 2019 protests that ousted Governor Ricardo Rosselló. Actually, Benito Bad Bunny had a tour in Europe, and he actually stopped the tour to travel to Puerto Rico and join the protest movement. And so overnight, him, Residente Anile, dropped this song basically demanding the resignation of Governor Ricardo Rosselló. So it's a very political song, and it became sort of a political anthem of that summer 2019 protests.
Mm, thank you. And next, you mentioned this already, 2022, the song El Apagón.
El Apagón is a song about power outages in Puerto Rico. It's also an homage to one of our greatest salsa singers, Maelo Rivera. It has some obscene words that says that I love, and I'm saying this in a non-vulgar way, but I love Puerto Rican women's genitalia. Uh, and so a lot of people are like, oh, that is so disrespectful. But really, he was doing a play on some Argentinians that were despectively talking about Puerto Rican women. And so he's appropriating that and incorporating into the song. And the song ends up with his former partner, Gabriela Berlingeri, singing about displacement. So it's a song about power outages and displacement, and the music video, which I highly encourage everyone to see, turns into a 20-minute documentary, very well done, on gentrification in Puerto Rico.
Excellent. And lastly, the 2025 song La Mudanza.
La Mudanza is a beautiful salsa song that talks about Benito's personal upbringing, about his parents, but then turns into sort of like a political homage. It talks about Puerto Rican resistance. The music video is also, it has a lot of symbolism, and I know that firsthand. I can't say why, but it's full of Easter eggs of pro-independence symbolism, and I think it's in La Mudanza where he has a bar that says something along the lines that he wants his songs playing when Hostos is returned. And so, just a very quick, if I may, Eugenio Maria de Hostos is a 19th century intellectual that died in early 20th century in the Dominican Republic. He was a pro-independence intellectual, and when he died, he asked for his remains not to be brought back to Puerto Rico until Puerto Rico was free and independent. And so, by Benito saying that, he is positioning himself politically in favor of independence and hoping that when that happens, his songs are blasting.
Beautiful. I think that might be the best possible way to close out tonight as well. I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight. This was an incredible conversation, and I know we could go on forever. So I encourage everyone to not only check out the songs that we just discussed tonight, but definitely to pick up a copy of Puerto Rico: A National History. Thank you, Dr. Melendez-Badillo. It was such a pleasure and honor to host you. And thank you to everyone who's joined us from across the country. From the World Affairs Council of Connecticut, we're wishing everyone the best. We hope to see you again soon. And in the meantime, we will be watching the Super Bowl together. We encourage you also to share this knowledge with your friends, recommend the book. And for future events, please check out the World Affairs Council of Connecticut website, where there are more events coming up, as well as stay tuned for a event recording of tonight so that you can check out this conversation, revisit, or share with a friend. So once again, good night. Thank you everyone so much. And thank you so much, Dr. Melendez-Badillo. Stay safe out there, everyone, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.